The American Depression. So if you get a question about the Depression, you need to realise that really the Americans were heading towards depression all throughout the 1920s. But they totally had not seen this because they'd been living in a bubble of prosperity. So what happened after the Wall Street crash in 1929? It became all too apparent that what was going to happen was they were going to be in a complete economic collapse. And they were in that until they decided to get into the Second World War in 1941. So, you could get asked about 3 people who suffered specifically during the Depression. You could get asked about the unemployed, and that also includes the homeless. The people who were businessmen, because that's obviously significant, how did they suffer? And also you could get asked about the farmers. So in this podcast, I'm going to go over the 3 different groups and how they suffered during the American Depression. So here goes, the unemployed. The unemployed, unfortunately, were the ones that probably were the hardest hit. Because they were unemployed, it meant that they lost their homes. So a lot of the unemployed became homeless simply because they couldn't repay the mortgages. So they ended up living in something called a Hooverville. And Hoovervilles were obviously named after President Hoover because he'd done nothing to help them during the Depression. So these were slum areas on the edge of towns where they found anything they could find in rubbish tips to try and make makeshift shelters. They also used to have to use newspapers to cover them, and they nicknamed those Hoover blankets. And because they didn't have any money to buy shoes, the ones that were falling apart, they called those Hoover leather. So ultimately, they were mocking Hoover for how little he was doing to help them during the Depression. Unfortunately as well for the unemployed, they became unemployed because 100,000 companies shut down between 1929 and 1932. And yes, of course, during the years of prosperity during the 1920s, a lot of these people had happily borrowed from banks. And when the banks wanted the loans repaid that they loaned off them, they couldn't afford that, so then they not only became unemployed, they also became homeless. Now, 12,000 people became unemployed every day, and that is a massively important statistic. And straight after the Wall Street crash, 3% of people were unemployed, but by 1932, that was 25% of the workforce. So you're looking at between 12 and 15 million people in America were unemployed. The figure obviously varies purely because nobody knows exactly, because sometimes they've got a little bit of employment, then they lost that, then they might get something else, but there's a little bit of employment, then they lost that. So it's between 12 and 15 million unemployed. Now, some of the people who were unemployed as well became migrant workers. And I'm sure you know this through Of Mice and Men that you did in English. So George and Lennon of Mice and Men will be seen as migrant workers. But the name for them in history is hobos. So what that meant was they would get just on any railroad, go on the railroad, jump off somewhere else to try and find a job. But unfortunately, a lot of these places didn't want them because there was a lot of seasonal work, which was okay, so some did get jobs, but a lot of them were told to move on elsewhere because everywhere in America couldn't find enough jobs for the people who actually lived in that area. So that was a huge problem for them. And some of them took it upon themselves to do self-advertising. So what they did was they just used 2 boards on the front and on the back, and they advertised about, what work experience they had, how old they were. Some of them were saying obviously they'd been war veterans. So all of these things made people think, oh, well, maybe we should give them a chance at trying to get a job. So what I'm saying in terms of this is the unemployed did suffer terribly. And they also not only became homeless, they also were starving to death. And some people, unfortunately, couldn't be saved. In New York in 1931, people had queued round the block in something called a bread line. So they completely and utterly relied on charities. So the soup and bread kitchens were put on by charities to try and feed them. And in places like Chicago, Al Capone actually bankrolled Chicago, so he helped the poor people in Chicago because 50% of the people there were unemployed because so many industries had shut down. So these bread lines sprung up all across America, and people really had no choice. They wanted a job, but there was no jobs to get, so they felt they just had to rely on charities to keep them alive. Things got so bad for the unemployed that some of them started to commit crimes just to simply spend a night in jail. They were absolutely desperate. That is how bad the American Depression had got. And they also sold really important possessions to them, like the wedding rings, you know, cars, the Model T Ford cars that they'd obviously always wanted. These things were getting sold for whatever they could sell them for. And America really fell from grace. They went from being the richest country in the world to almost the poorest overnight. And the unemployed just spiralled and spiralled and spiralled out of control. It honestly did look like there was nothing that could be done for them. And an important statistic to remember is by the winter of 1932, 23,000 people in that winter decided to commit suicide. And the reason for that was they never felt they were going to get out of the Depression. For 3 winters they'd lived in it, and it was progressively getting worse because Hoover and the Republicans were doing nothing to help them. So if you get asked about the unemployed, you can talk in detail about how much the unemployed were actually suffering.